Okay, so we're going to walk through some of the basics of using Autodesk Eagle. Used to be CADsoft, now it's owned by Autodesk. You've probably heard of them before. And I'm going to just kind of go through some of the basics here as we start. So the first thing you'll notice when you open up Eagle is that it has this kind of what they call the control panel up in the left corner here. This is the shell that holds the other main parts of the program. So it may not seem very intuitive the first time you look at this. But what we're going to do is click on the File button and then go New Project. And it gives you an option here to put in a name for this project. So I'll just put ELTN 115. I'll call this First Schematic. Okay. Now once we do that, if you right click here, we can add New Schematic. And now what it does is it launches what is called the schematic editor. So all of this still runs under the main shell of the Eagle program. Sorry, I had to adjust my frame there. So one of the things that I'm going to start off right away that is very important in working in industry, in engineering, is keeping track of your projects you work on. And project management is very critical. If you just save a file to your laptop and your laptop hard drive goes out or you have some other issues, you can lose all the work that you worked on before. If you've ever used a thumb drive and lost it, or it's been damaged, you understand what that's like to go through. So you need to kind of decide how you're going to manage keeping track of your files. We'll be making lots of schematics and board files, but if you lose them through the semester, that's going to be a critical problem. I typically use a thumb drive. You could certainly use some cloud storage if you want to use Google Drive. Or what some students even do is email files to themselves because they know that they won't lose them that way. Whatever method you want to use, make sure that you back it up so you don't lose copies, because it's really difficult if you spend hours and hours working on a project and then lose it. And hopefully this won't happen this semester. Okay, so we've got some important, there's a lot of things we're going to go through in the coming weeks, but I'm going to just kind of get you started on some of the basics here. So on the top control, these buttons here, some of them are very familiar. For example, the file menus, you can save as, you can print a board. Same with editing, it gives you a whole bunch of options. But what we're going to typically use in this case are these different toolbars here. Now, when I click on one of these tools here, for example, let's say I'm going to add a part, which is this button here. When I click on that, typically it changes the context of the menus that are shown up here on the top. So the top menu bar really depends on which of the buttons on the left toolbar that you're using. So let's start here. The button that I just added or clicked was Add Part. That's that button right there. And I'm going to navigate down in this long selection here of all these different parts that we can use down to what are called the frames. Now, what we're looking at right here is what is called the Eagle library for the schematic and ultimately the parts that we use in the boards. And this is one of the beauties. It's kind of the love-hate relationship with these programs. There are lots and lots and lots of libraries, lots of parts you can use. The problem is trying to figure out what the part is that you're going to use and which ones you're going to use. And I'm going to really work with you to guide you through which parts you can use so that you don't have to try to hunt through all these many libraries to figure out what you need. In the previous page in this module, in this unit, I have a list of the different parts that we use in the libraries they're in. So we'll get into that in more detail. But for now, we're going to add a part and we're going to add a frame. And I'm going to start with a small frame here, the letter L frame. And you'll see a couple of things here. First of all, I can expand or collapse any one of these libraries that I'm using. In this case, I'm expanding it, and I've selected this letter L here. Okay, and it shows this image here showing what it is that you're expected to see on the schematic. Now, if we have an electronic component, you'll also see what you'd see on the board. But because this is just basically a drawing border, it's all that you're going to see in this case. Okay, so I'm going to click on OK. And as I move my mouse around, it'll allow me to move this part, in this case this frame, with this pick point in the bottom left corner. Now you'll notice down here on the bottom there's this little crosshairs here. And what that refers to is basically your X and Y coordinates. Okay, and that is the origin or the 0, 0 point. So if I left click and then hit the stop button up here, I've now placed a drawing frame in my schematic. Now you can only see a portion of it, and this is where it becomes important to look at these things called the zoom tools. Let me walk you through these real quick. The favorite one that I like is the zoom to fit. If you click on this, it'll basically fill in the drawing with the extents of what you have. You can also zoom in. Now in that case, it kind of zoomed in so far you can't see what's going on. But you can also use your scroll wheel on your mouse to manipulate zooming in or zooming out. But you can click on these buttons also. Now one really cool feature with Eagle is if I use that scroll bar, what it zooms into is relative to where my crosshairs here are. So let's say I want to zoom into this part of the frame here. If I hold it there and zoom in, I can zoom into that area. If I want to zoom in over here or zoom out over here, it changes the way it focuses kind of depending on where the location is. So that's very useful, for example, when we're moving around in a schematic to be able to kind of focus in on a certain area that we're working on. You can also use these bars on the bottom left, or bottom left to right, and the right top to bottom to navigate around in our image. Again, anytime if you get zoomed in too far and you go, where am I? I'm lost. You can always click on that zoom to fit button to see the extents of the frame that you're working with. The other one that's very useful is zoom select. If you click on that and left click and drag, it'll zoom to that area, a specific area on your schematic. Now, one of the biggest recommendations I make is you always want to zoom in very close to the area that you're working on. The problem that I see a lot of starting students miss is when they're working and they're way out on the schematic, it's hard to see the details of what they're doing. So you always want to make sure you're zoomed into the area that you're working on. So let's add a title to this, to the drawing that we're working on. And I'm going to click on this button down here called text. Now this is an example where now you see this menu bar on the top. All of this information is relevant to that particular function that we just clicked, which is a text. So I'm going to just type something here, for example, first project. I think we call this actually first schematic. I'll change that to first schematic and click OK. You'll notice a few things. The text is very small and it's this weird green color. If we want to change the color, we go up here to layer and I'm going to select symbols. That makes it a darker red color. I can also change the size of the text. And in this case, I'm going to scroll down and set it to 0.15. And then I'm going to click here, and that's going to be the location of the text. Now you'll notice that after I click, it still keeps whatever it was that what I'm adding on there. And you can click a lot of copies here. Now you might think, well, why would you want to do this? Well, when you're adding electronic components, it's convenient to add a bunch at the same time. Now, the way around this, I think using Control-Z is the fastest way to undo. But there's some other buttons you can use to undo commands up here to undo or redo. And then if I hit Escape, it'll take me back to that menu box. I hit Escape again, and I'm back to where I started. So again, how I did that, I clicked on the text box. I changed the layer here, I changed the size, typed my text, and then placed it over in the title block here. Now you notice that the title here, Untitled, is related to the actual file name up here on the top. So once you actually save this file, you'll see that title actually change there. Okay, so let's see what the next thing is that we can work on. Let's see if we can add some parts here. Oh, another thing I wanted to mention really quick. There is, as we add parts and get into more complex drawings, sometimes it's nice to add a grid. and that shows you the resolution of what we can move to. Now, where this becomes important is this. Let's say I zoom in on this text here. When I try to move this, you'll notice that it'll only allow me to move it on whatever the grid is. Okay? So if you wanted to move it to finer resolution, if you click on the grid button, I can change that, for example, to 0.05 inches up there. Okay? And now I can move this by using the move button here. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. I'm sorry, I'm used to this software, so I'll try to make sure I don't go too fast. Whenever you're moving something, you want to make sure that you're clicking on the pick point. Sometimes those are in different locations. Okay? And I'm zooming in and out using the scroll wheel. But that gives me finer resolution of where I'm moving parts on the board or on the schematic. I'd recommend not using a resolution much smaller than 0.05 or it becomes difficult. It's easy to make misconnections. So if you click on grid, we can turn that on or off. I'll leave it on for now because it'll make it a little easier to see where we're at. Okay, so I'm going to zoom back out to fit. The next thing I'm going to do is add an electronic component. So I'm going to use the add button here. I'm going to collapse that frames library, and I'm going to scroll down to RCL. That stands for resistors, capacitors, inductors, the passive devices. And I'm going to go down to RUS. So that's a sub-library. And I'm going to go to RUS 0204/7. Now here we have the schematic symbol that we're working with, and we have the physical layout, what we'd actually see on the circuit board itself. And they also give us a 3D image, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The 0204 refers to the diameter. The /7 is the lead spacing in millimeters between the two pins. So for example, if we wanted to get a larger resistor with more spacing, we might select an 0207/10 or even a larger one, 0309/12. But for the most part, we'll use this library component. And this, if this is kind of like you think, how am I going to figure out where this is? Don't worry, you'll learn how to navigate pretty quickly. And the reference guide I published will have more information on that. Okay, so you'll notice the resistor looks really small. I'm going to zoom in using the scroll wheel here, and I can place it on our schematic. Now you'll notice that it automatically will number the resistors in sequence. Now if I don't want to add any more resistors, I can hit stop. And the next thing I'm going to do, though, is one of the things that's missing here is what is the value of the resistor. It's important to keep track of this. So if you look over here, we can change the name of the resistor or we can change the value. There are a few different ways to do this, and I'm sure you'll figure out some shortcuts too. But one way to do that is to click on that value button and then clicking on the resistor. And I'm going to just change this to a value of 330 ohms. And the same thing for R2. We'll make it 330 also. And that'd be my recommendation, that as you're making these schematics, as you're creating schematics, that you make sure you add the component values as you go. Otherwise, you can lose track of things. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is make an electrical connection between these two pins. And for that, we use a command called the net. It is not the line command, which is over, or bus command. It is what is called the net command. I'm sorry, the line command is down here. Make sure you use the net. That's the one that's making the electrical connection. Okay? If I click on that, okay, I can drag around, and every time I left click, it'll allow me to move at a right angle, and then I can click and terminate the wire. Now what's very important here, I'm going to undo this. Whoops, went too far. I'm using Control-Y to redo there. What's very important is that you terminate the net properly. A common mistake students make is this. They'll make a connection, they'll bring it down here, and then they'll click at some point too far past the resistor. Okay? And if that happens, or let's say they move it even all the way over here, if that happens, the net will not terminate. It'll keep going on, and that's a bad sign. We know something's wrong there. In fact, if you look very closely, that net has overlapped the resistor. So we want to make sure we don't do that. We want to make sure that whenever we end our net connection, that we left click on the end of the wire. Now, another hint or another suggestion that I have is if you want to see where the pins are, they kind of show up when you mouse over them. Those are the pins. But if you want to see where the pins are, the termination points, if you click on View Layer Setting, you can select Pins, and now those little pads will show up. Then they'll stay there so you can see where the connections are. I don't use those all the time because it ends up kind of looking a little bit cluttered. So that's up to you if you want to use that to start with. But if you want to take that layer off, you can, of the pins. By the way, this is also where we can disable values, names, other layers that are in this drawing. And we might do that a little bit later on. Okay. Now, so I've got this circuit here. I've added 2 resistors. I have the values. I've made an electrical connection. The next thing I'm going to do is add some capacitors. Now this circuit is going to be kind of a nonsense circuit. It doesn't really make sense. It's not practical, but I'm just doing this to kind of walk you through the basics. Okay, so if we go up to now, for example, CUS, these are some more common types of capacitors. And I'm going to select one that's 025 by 075. This is called a box capacitor. It's typically some kind of polyester type material. The lead spacing is 7.5 millimeters. I'm sorry, the grid spacing is 5 millimeters between the leads, but the outline, the physical package, is 2.5 millimeters by 7.5 millimeters. And that's kind of embedded in this whole package name here. As you can see, there are lots of options here. So we'll try to kind of limit some of these to some extent. Okay, so to kind of do that again, I'm going to go to Add Part here. I navigated in the RCL library to CUS, and I'm selecting this part CUS 050-025 by 075. Click OK. Now, to rotate any component, you simply have to right-click. Okay, and I'm going to add these capacitors kind of in this weird orientation here, like that. Now, what's kind of cool is that I've added these parts, and if you add a part and overlap it with the other pin, I'm going to click on Move here, it will automatically make a connection. So rather than actually having to draw a net to connect them, you can land pins on top of each other when you place the components. Okay, now we're going to draw another net here, and draw this over here, like that. And I'm going to add a couple of values here. I'm going to click on the value, and for example, let's say this is a 0.1 microfarad, and this is also 0.1 microfarad. And later on, I'll get you a little more familiar with how to kind of look at, we can rotate these parts, the values, if we click on it and then right click it, it allows us to rotate them around. So the orientation looks a little bit better, like that. Okay, now the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to add some power pins here because without any kind of power the circuit isn't very practical. And I'm going to go to Add Part, collapse these 2 libraries, and go down to Supply 1 to get our 5-volt value. Okay, that vertical arrow there are some other symbols you can see that they use for VCC, for example, but we're going to just stick with a 5-volt value there. Okay, and I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to place that power pin over here. Now, what's kind of cool, if I want to add, for example, a ground pin, if I hit Escape, it takes me back to the library, and that's convenient rather than having to go back and forth. Now, the common ground symbol that's very common is the digital ground, and you'll find that in Supply 2. So, sorry, I'm doing that kind of quickly. If we go to Supply 2, we go to DGND, digital ground. I'm going to add a ground symbol there. And to stop, I can either hit Stop or Escape twice. I'll hit Stop there. Okay, so this is what the circuit looks like so far. Now I'm going to add 2 more nets here. going like that. Now it's saying merge net segment $2 into supply net and 5 volts, plus 5 volts. That's fine. It's just saying we're combining two nets, and is that okay? Same thing there. Okay. Now, this is our complete circuit. Not going to do much. I guess it could be some kind of weird filter circuit, but I'm just using this again as an example. It's pretty small for our whole schematic package or schematic frame here. But I've always found that if I start with a bigger schematic frame, I always end up filling it up. So it's not a bad idea to start with something larger. Now, let's say we wanted to move this whole circuit over to like the middle of the screen. Well, we could click on the move button and one by one click and move these different parts, but it's pretty tedious. What we can do is group this whole set of components using this group function over here. I'm going to click on group and I'm going to left click and drag over the whole area that I'm interested in moving. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. I can click on move, and if I right click, it'll say move group, and that allows me to move it to, for example, the middle of the schematic page. The other way you can do that is by holding down Control and right click at the same time, and that also allows you to move it around if you like the hotkeys. There are a lot of different hotkeys, and I'm just going to try to touch on a few of them as we go. Okay, so this is kind of, I just wanted to kind of start off on the beginning of an Eagle schematic. I'm going to probably add another video like this week to get into a little bit more detail on how we create schematics. But what I'd like you to do is start with this schematic. Go ahead and work through this as an example. If you want to just run the video while you're launching Eagle and running it, that'd be great. I'm starting off slow here. I know we're 22 minutes in here, and it seems like a lot of time just to explain this. But there's so many different little parts to Eagle that are important. I want to make sure that we can start with something that you can kind of review and rewind if you want to. And to start to get some good practices going, like making sure that you put the values of the components on right away. Okay, so that's the end of this video. I don't want to go on too much longer here, but I'll see if I can, I'm going to probably post a longer video and an assignment a little bit later, probably tomorrow.